my beautiful recording machinery. Yeah, I guess the first thing to ask is how we would like to do our session today. As usual, we have the option of going for a bit of breaking, or pushing through and ending early. Do people have strong preferences either way?
Maybe just see it on maybe like the 5 minutes.
That is perfectly sensible. Sounds good to me. A couple admin things before we get going. The first is that finally, done all of the sample essay questions and sample critical analysis topics and everything. I was trying to get them uploaded, but of course, my internet connection decided to shit itself. So I didn't manage to do that, but I've got them here. I should be able to do it either during the break or immediately after class. So these are all set. And I figured what we could do is take a bit of time to talk about them either in this class, depending on how quickly we go through the Grice stuff, or next class, depending on how quickly we go through the other Grice stuff. So one way or the other, spend a little bit of time talking about it. But just as a kind of warning is the wrong thing, but as a description about the exam questions, what I've tried to do and what I will try to do is make each question on stuff that we've spent a good bit of time talking about. So there'll always be something that there's like, hey, here's a slide or 2 slides specifically on. It will be a point that we have kind of made some emphasis about. And it's always going to be relatively self-contained. So I'm not going to ask you something that's like, give me one that goes across 3 lectures. It will be instead, give me something that's from this. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So let's talk about Grice on meaning. I kind of like this picture of Grice. It makes him look a bit like a ghost. I searched to find some nice pictures of him, and almost all of them are variants of this one photo that's like on the collection of his essays. There are no pictures of him as a young person. I think this is just what he looked like his whole life. Which again, maybe he is a ghost? I'm not sure. Anyway, so what I want to do is start off by talking about Grice's overall project. The big project that he's engaged with regards to understanding meaning and understanding, in effect, the whole semantic project. How meaning gets going and how we should understand its relationship to particular utterances and sentence meaning. It's a very neat kind of inversion. Hey, come on in. Hey, come on in. It's a neat inversion of the projects that we were looking at, or that kind of underlie Russell and Frege, or at least the basic spirit of Russell and Frege. So I want to say a little bit about Grice's overall project, and then talk about the first bit of the essay, where he pulls apart 2 notions of meaning. One of which he'll call natural meaning, and the other he calls non-natural. Then once we've got that distinction in mind, we're going to go through his account of non-natural meaning, or meaning NN. That'll take us basically most of the time, and we'll talk about 2 potential problems. One that was meant as a kind of friendly problem to deal with, and one that's real bad for his project. Yeah, that's the kind of plan. I guess before we get going too, how did people find the Grice? How did you find the reading this week? Didn't like it?
No, I mean, my entire weekend was basically anxiety-induced tutoring, so when I read it, I wasn't really there.
In for it. Fair.
But yeah, that kind of captures the essence of how I feel about it. I didn't really understand it.
Fair. How about other people? Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll talk through it, and hopefully that will make it a little bit better. So again, the first thing, Grice's project, the big aim. The big aim is we're going to get a whole account of meaning, entirely based on a notion of intention. So it's basically going to be everything is going to reduce down to or be explained by psychological states. Note that the kind of psychological states we have in mind aren't like ideas that we had at the beginning. Do you remember that there was that idealistic account of language, the sort of broadly Lockean one, where ideas were something like mental pictures? So this is going to be along those lines, but distinct. Instead of mental pictures, we're going to have something like what we'll call intentions. We want to give a full semantic theory, an account of meaning, according to which the meaning of an individual utterance is going to be explained by, effectively, the psychological state it's intended to produce. And interestingly, the state, or the intended to produce state, is going to be partially explained by a speaker's intentions. What's really key here is that there's going to be a huge focus on the idea of using language to communicate. So again, this is kind of coming back to stuff we talked about in the very first lecture, but the core thought is going to be that when people make utterances, when people use language, there's an intention to have an audience believe or do or blah, 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 something. There's something that you want in the world, either in terms of beliefs or actions or preferences or whatever, and that's what we're really trying to do with speech, with utterances. And this is a rough inversion of the sort of project that people like Frege and Russell had, in the sense that it's going to be what speakers intend that's going to fix the meaning of particular words or sentences, rather than the other way around. So I might remember, right, we talked about Strawson's objection to Russell. And one of Strawson's objections to Russell, in amongst the things, was that when we talk about meaning, sentences don't have meanings, utterers do. A sentence doesn't say or mean anything, speakers do. The kind of project that Grice has buys into that big time. And we're going to look at what speakers intend, and individual speakers' intentions with communicative acts is going to fix what happens at the bigger sentential level, and that's then going to fix what happens more generally. So that's the Gricean project. You're going to have an intention-based semantics. And it's reductive and particularistic. It's reductive in the sense that we're always going to be reducing the more general to the more particular. And it's particularistic in that at the very bottom are going to be specific communicative acts. So we're going to see that the meaning of a sentence, a general sentence, is definable in terms of how the expression is typically used for meaningful utterances, how we use most of the time. And then this typical meaningful use is going to be defined in terms of our product of each specific individual usage. There's a kind of conglomeration. And then specific or individual uses are going to be definable in terms of particular intentions. The contents of speakers' minds, the intentions that give rise to the production of the utterance, what you want to convey. The trick is going to be getting these right, getting the intentions right. If we can get those right, the rest is just going to kind of bubble up. So the first thing that we're going to do, and the first step in Grice's big project, is identifying or pinning down the relevant notion of meaning. And this notion of meaning is going to have to be cashed out in terms of intentions. So before we even go to that, though, do we see the big project? Does it make sense? Again, the thought is, our base unit is going to be what particular speakers in a particular instance want, what they intend their audience to pick up on. That will then fix the meaning of a given utterance. And then we take a bunch of those, and that will give us something like typical utterance. And then typical utterance meaning is going to fix the meaning of the sentence, if there is even such a thing. Another way to put it is we have particular use, fixed conventional use, and conventional use will give us sentence meaning. This is a flip to the Russell-Frege project, where what we were worried about is something like the meaning of particular terms, and then that's supposed to explain what individuals mean whenever they use those terms. So that's the big thing in the background. So how do we get it going? Well, here's the very beginning. Again, we want to pin down a notion of meaning. Sorry, this is not a terribly lovely image to have. But first thing, the first move in the paper is to talk about some examples of sentences in English that feature means. And the aim is to talk about them and note that these are not the right kind of means. So our first idea is let's talk about natural meaning, or as Grice also calls it, non-cognitive meaning. And we can think about 3 examples. These are all from the paper. Those spots mean measles. Those spots didn't mean anything to me, but to the doctor they meant measles. And the recent budget means that we'll have a hard year. The last one's a bit cutting, but fair. So in all these cases, we have this occurrence of means or meant. But in every case, the notion of means here isn't something like linguistic meaning. It's something different. When we say those spots mean measles, what are we actually after? We're after the idea that these are a sign that you have measles. Or having these spots entails having measles. So the characteristics of natural meaning, or this non-cognitive sense of meaning, well, Grice talks about basically 5. Exactly how different these characteristics are, questionable. The big one is success. That is, X means that P entails P. Those spots mean measles. That entails you have measles. If you have those spots, you must have measles. The rest of them are various things about how we might play around in the grammar. So one of them, often it's called non-objectifiability. If we have X meant that P, well, that's not going to entail that what was meant by X was P. Where meant here is used in this kind of linguistic or conveying sense. It's also agent independent. X meant that P doesn't entail someone meant that P by X. Again, to go back, looking at our measles case, nobody means that. That's just kind of happening. It's also non-linguistic, right? X meant that P can't be restated as X meant phi, where phi is going to be some other sentence. And finally, the last one, again, tying back to success, it's going to be fact involving. We can restate these kinds of claims as the fact that na-na-na means or meant the fact that na-na-na. The fact that you have those measles, or the fact that you have those spots, meant that you had measles. The big one here is, again, success. You have an entailment. So that's natural meaning. And that's fair, but not really the idea we're really keen on. Not the one we're going to define. The one we're going to define we'll call non-natural meaning. Meaning NN, or communicative meaning. We can get at these by, again, thinking of examples, just to take a few from the paper. The first one, those 3 rings on the bell mean that the bus is full. Or to take one from a slightly more local example, that ding means the bus is going to stop at the next stop. Hopefully everyone's familiar with that, right? Another example, Smith couldn't go on without his trouble and strife means or meant that Smith found his wife indispensable. Just a little bit of Cockney rhyming slang there. Christ showing off. So what's going on in these occurrences of meaning? Well, it's not the same as the one we had previously. It's not that whenever you hear those 3 rings of the bell, it guarantees or entails that the bus is full. It's meant to communicate this idea. Because the bus driver might get it wrong. Or it might be that we say this, but in fact, Smith did find his wife dispensable. He's going through a divorce. The notion we have here is, again, we'll call non-natural meaning. And it's non-natural, to put really bluntly, because, to go back, the sense of means that we're invoking here is something like, almost like causation. Or certainly like entailment. And that's not what's going on here. And we can get a kind of feel for this by thinking about this example. So let's have M express this. The symbols in the arrangement below means you have measles. And then you have this sequence of letters. Now notably, the assertion made by M is true even if the italic bit's false. That is, even if you don't have measles, this means you do. That's the sense of means we're invoking here. Right? This expresses something like a proposition, say. Unlike, this is a symptom. Note that if this makes sense, then we've already seen that this notion of meaning doesn't behave according to success. Entailment fails. Because this says you have measles, but it doesn't entail it. That could be false. Another real way to kind of draw it out is in cases of non-natural meaning or meaning in N, we can follow means or mean with a quotation, or as Grice puts it, a phrase in inverted commas. For example, it doesn't make sense to say those spots mean he has measles. If we put it in quotations like this, we've got something that's effectively ungrammatical. But we can say something like, those 3 rings on the bell mean the bus is full. That ding on the bus means I'm going to stop at the next place. So the general idea for determining the difference, it's consistent with something having a relevant non-natural meaning, that what it non-naturally means is false, but not the other way around. It is inconsistent with something having a natural meaning that the thing meant is false. If you have those spots, you must have measles. If you hear the 3 bells, it doesn't mean that the bus is in fact full. The guy could have gotten it wrong. If you hear the ding on the bus, it doesn't mean that it's actually guaranteed to stop. The driver might make a mistake and keep going. So again, before we trundle on, do we get the feeling, the difference between meaning in the natural sense and non-natural meaning? Maybe another way to come at this, put really, really bluntly, is every instance of natural meaning is going to be replaceable with something like entails, or is caused by, or guarantees. And that's not the kind of thing that will be the case with non-natural meaning. Non-natural meaning is the sort of stuff that we're after when we say, I don't know, grass is grün means grass is green. Natural meaning doesn't have much to do with the meaning of sentences and utterances, but it's relatively unmysterious, it's fairly straightforward. We're always going to be able to do a substitution along these lines. So, X naturally means that P, you can understand as something like X causes P or is involved in causing P. X is conclusive evidence for P. X is impossible unless P. X entails P. Again, this natural notion of meaning is meant to give you an unbreakable connection, something very close to entailment. Non-natural meaning does not do that. You can hear some words, and that doesn't automatically get you to whatever those words are meant to mean. Again, feel the split? Does the difference here make sense? All right. So, Grice is going to give us a story that's meant to that's meant to be an account of this non-natural meaning. And the story is going to, again, boil down to speaker intentions. Exactly how the story goes is going to be a bit finicky, but we're going to have to go through them. So here's our first stab. And it's a really basic one, and it's from, I think, Stevenage. And it's, all right, maybe we can just use causation. So we can have this idea. X non-naturally means something, if and only if X has the tendency to produce such and such a cognitive effect in a hearer, and or to be produced by that state in the speaker. So, what's really the idea here is that we're going to have a non-natural meaning if there's a kind of tendency or causal power of a certain utterance and a certain cognitive effect, a psychological state. So, grass is grün non-naturally means that grass is green because it has a tendency to prompt in you the belief that grass is green. That sequence of sounds has a tendency to promote a certain psychological state, belief that grass is green. Or Grice refers to a philosopher, has a certain non-natural meaning because it has a tendency to produce in speakers, or it has a tendency to be associated with speakers' beliefs that Grice is a philosopher. Note in every case here what we're doing is kind of leaning on either something intended by the speaker or some psychological state in the listener. Belief, behavior, whatever. You don't really care. So this is a kind of naive idea, but it runs into some immediate problems. So Grice's case involves dressing up to go dancing. And maybe tells you something about Grice's social class, the example. He talks about putting on a tailcoat in order to go dancing. But people are inclined to put on tailcoats and presumably top hats to go dancing. So what happens then is there's a tendency to produce certain beliefs. My putting on a tailcoat tends to make my audience, those who see me dressing, think I'm going to a dance. There's a tendency to produce such and such a cognitive effect in a hearer whenever I put on top hat and tails. The problem, though, is that doesn't non-naturally mean anything. My putting on my top hat and tails doesn't non-naturally mean anything. It's maybe some evidence, it's some natural meaning that I'm going to go do some stuff. But it doesn't actually say anything. It doesn't convey any propositional content. It's not like, I got dressed. That has a certain kind of non-natural meaning, but my actually doing it doesn't. The problem is, it ticks the right-hand side of the if and only if, but fails to tick the left. So that's the first case. And again, do we see how the first case works? why this is a problem for the account. So what we have on the analysis is it's just this causal relationship. There's a tendency to produce certain effects. That's cheap. That's too easy. Because we'll have plenty of things that have a tendency to produce certain cognitive effects which have no non-natural meaning. And we can also put it in terms of states and speakers, right? I'll put on a tailcoat because I think I'm about to go dancing. But my putting it on isn't non-natural meaning I'm about to go dancing. It's just something I want to do if I want to dress up, if I'm going to go to the gala, say. So what's wrong with this initial account, this initial causal account? First things first, Grice says it omits a notion of intention. That is, it doesn't say, because it's just talking about what tends to be produced, it doesn't talk about what I wanted to convey, or what I intended to bring about. Maybe I was trying to be ironic. I was trying to lie to you, prompt some kind of weird belief. And the other problem is, it's got an over-focus on what we might think of as the standard meaning, what usually occurs in these cases. Not what a particular speaker may have meant with a particular utterance on a specific occasion. So it focuses on the general, and that's a problem. And it doesn't pay attention to the particular intentions at that one instance. And note that these two go hand in hand. Because it focuses on standard meaning, what tends to be the case, it ignores particular intentional actions, which you might think are important when, say, we're talking about utterances. So much the worse for our initial causal account. It doesn't get the analysis correct. So what we might do, as a first pass on fixing it, is, well, look, this had the problem because it talked about the tendency to produce. Why don't we just replace tendency to produce with something like intention to produce? That should get around these cases. So we might have something like this. We'll take the causal account, we replace tends to produce with is intended to produce. So here's our analysis roughly. X means, in this non-natural sense, that P, if and only if X is intended by its utterer to induce in an audience the belief that P. And note, what we're going to do here is we're just thinking about particular cases. We can generalize it back out. So this is only going to be when I'm making statements or declarations. But we could extend it back to questions, commands, everything. So here's a first pass just for statements. Looks better than our causal account. It's not going to run into the problem of things like the top, coat, and tails, but still not quite right. So think about why it's not quite right. Take a very slightly silly example, again from Grice. I might take Wim's handkerchief and I might leave it at a crime scene. And I might do so with the intention of inducing, in the detective investigating the case, the belief that Wim is guilty of the murder. Okay, so my act of leaving the handkerchief, I intend to induce a certain belief in my audience, namely, Wim is the one who had done it. But, says Grice, my leaving the handkerchief does not non-naturally mean anything. It is not an utterance. It is not something that's a proper communicative act. If anything, it's more like something like a failed natural meaning. I'm trying to mislead people by invoking a fake natural meaning. It'd be like if I drew a bunch of red dots on you, and then we said, oh, these spots mean you have measles. That's sort of what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to induce in the detective a false belief through a kind of entailment, but it's a false entailment. It's subtle, but do we see the thought process here? Okay, why it's not going to non-naturally mean anything? So again, what we have is a variation on the analysis, but we can come up with cases where the right-hand side is true, the left-hand side is not. So, not so good. But this is better. How might we fix it? How can we avoid our Colombo problem? Well, what we might do is appeal to something we might call a reflexive intention. That is, according to Grice, what we need is an intention on the part of the speaker that the hearer, the audience, recognize the speaker's intention to induce a belief in the hearer. That sounds really weird, but let's talk through it again. Right? So we're going to have to add an extra intention. Right? I intend for you to believe the P. But also, one of the things that I hope you do is that realize that's my intention. Not just do I want you to believe the P, I want you to click that I'm trying to get you to believe the P. It's my aim to get you to believe the P. That's the sort of reflexive intention. So we have this two-part analysis. X non-naturally means that P, if and only if X is intended by its utterer to induce the belief that P, I want you to come to believe it. And I intend that you should recognize that's my intention. Not only do I want you to get to P, but I want you to see that that's where I'm trying to get you to. So again, what's the thought process here? The thought process is, well, there needs to be some kind of aim that we're going to, but in order for it to be a genuine communicative act, you need to clock that I'm trying to get you somewhere. That this isn't just some random stuff happening, that I have an intention for you to buy into. So to go back, to talk about the case we just had, right? It avoids this sort of problem because my audience, the detective, as soon as he finds out that my intention was to get him to believe this, won't believe it. Because he'll know that I set up the evidence as a fake. But obviously, if I have a genuine communicative act, then there should be something like, I intend you to get there, and I want you to recognize that is my intention. And this is so close to what we want. Grice says, okay, this is almost perfect, but we have a few more problem cases. He talks about quite a few, but probably the funniest one is involving him showing Mr. X a photograph of Mr. Y, quote, showing undue familiarity with Mrs. X. So the thought is, right, Grice and Mr. X are sitting there, and Grice pulls out a Polaroid of Mr. Y and Mrs. X doing their thing, right? And what are we going to say in this case? Well, it seems pretty clear that in this case, Grice could be construed as intending to induce a belief that Mr. Y and Mrs. X are having an affair. It also seems arguable that Grice intends for Mr. X to recognize that's what he's trying to do. But we wouldn't or shouldn't, says Grice, say that this act of giving the picture non-naturally means that there's an affair going on between the two. Now, why should we not say that? Why is this not going to get us to non-natural meaning? what's wrong with this case? Because it's really close, right? I mean, it feels like this sort of thing where we're very close to a communicative act. Vim asked me something about his partner. Like, oh, you know, I'm worried my partner's having an affair. And I hand him a Polaroid of his partner kissing some other person. It feels like I'm communicating something. Yeah?
Isn't the picture doing the communicating and not the person having the picture?
Yeah, that's the problem. The act of handing the picture, that's the thing that I'd be doing. And if there's any communication going on, it's somehow being conveyed by the representative image, not the act. And that's the problem. It looks like my handing the picture is the X. And that's not quite right. But again, we're close. We're so close. So what do we need? What's the last thing we need? Well, we're going to add a third clause. And the idea, says Grice, is we need a connection between the intention and belief the speaker is trying to induce. It needs to be by means of a recognition of the intention that the audience is induced to have a relevant belief. So we get this tripartite analysis. A speaker, if they're going to non-naturally mean P by X, going to have three intentions. First, that the audience believe that P. Second, the audience should recognize that first intention. And the third one is that I intend that this recognition will cause the belief. So here's the thought, is that by you seeing I have this intention, that will at least play a partial role in making you come to believe the initial content. So it's helpful with a kind of, yeah.
I don't see how this solves the previous problem.
So the idea is that while the initial, like the showing of the picture isn't a non-natural meaning, what I might do is say he needed to recognize some kind of causal relationship between my intention of showing and the coming to belief. So it still isn't going to deal with the issue about the pictures doing the heavy lifting. But there isn't this third thing. I don't think it's him recognizing my intention that's causing his belief. It's looking at the damn picture that's causing the belief. The third clause isn't met. That's why we don't have the non-natural meaning in the picture case. So what we're doing is making it line up. This side's false, and so is that side. That's why it's helping us out with this case. But what we'll be able to do then is if, say, I said something like, you should look at this. The act of saying you should look at this while passing the picture will now pass this test. Because I'm trying to convey something, namely that he should believe his partner is having an affair. I want him to recognize that that's what I'm trying to do, and he should recognize that in my acts, both of saying and passing, he should come to believe that this person's having an affair. That third clause is going to do some heavy lifting, either to block bad cases or to justify and add some details. So we get this tripartite case. Roughly put, we can say A non-naturally meant something by X, roughly equivalent to A uttered X with the intention of inducing a belief by means of the recognition of this intention. So I have some goal I want to get you to, and I will partially induce this belief by you recognizing that I'm trying to get you to this goal. That's the kind of lovely reflective bit. It's this. And then this recognition is going to be at least a partial explanation for why you have this content. Okay. So before we go on, again, do we see how the parts interlock? So it's a fun analysis. And the big thing with it is, again, that core to it all is a particular speaker's intentions and a particular utterance. Note in this analysis, there is absolutely nothing that is restricting things in terms of what words or actions or utterances are actually used. In theory, you could make any fucking noises you want. If it does this, and it does this, and it does this, you're done. You managed to communicate what you wanted. There are no constraints coming from the language. It's all going to be about whether you can get these three things hit. Which is kind of cool. Because that looks like maybe a nice place to start with regards to language formation. Or the initial runs of meaning. So this brings us kind of full circle. The root Gricean idea we can basically express something like this. Non-natural meaning is to be analyzed in terms of reflexive intentions. And the intention to induce a psychological state, belief, knowledge, whatever, by means of a recognition of that intention. Again, go back, that's these two. So it's reflexive. You clock the intention, and that will get you to where the intention is supposed to take you. And one of the upshots of this story is that it entails a speaker's meaning, what a particular individual intends to communicate at a given time, is more fundamental than anything like sentence meaning. Sentences mean what they do at a given time because of what its speakers intended to communicate by using them. And this directly inverts the idea that arguably Frege and Russell were talking about, where speakers mean what they do because of what the sentences they use mean. Why does Gödel prove the incompleteness of arithmetic mean what it does when I use it? According to Frege and Russell, and arguably Kripke, because of something about the very words that I'm using. Nothing about my intentions. Grice has flipped that story. We're not constrained by our language. Rather, our language works the way it does because of how we intend for it to work. It's a view that I kind of figured many people in this room might like. It makes sense. It makes really good sense. Okay. How we doing? Clear so far? Oh, beautiful. Let's keep going, because we don't have a hell of a lot more stuff. But I want to make sure that we get through it, we can end a little bit early. So, here's the big other thought. Grice wants to make sure, as he later puts it in another paper, we can distinguish between what we might call relativized meaning and non-relativized meaning. Relativized meaning is the kind of thing, the explication of which essentially comes back to what a speaker intended. You have to talk about a particular communicator or communicators. Non-relativized meaning, nah. Kick it back up. So again, do we see the thought? Grice wants to say relativized meaning comes first. It's the foundation. Because it's always going to come back to what particular communicators intended at a given instance. And that's then going to give us non-relativized meaning. It will be a generalization across the various intended uses. So non-relativized meaning can be reducible to or analyzed in terms of something like maybe a disjunction across all the relativized meanings. Or maybe something like a weighted disjunction, where most people use it this way, so this is the typical kind of intension, if you don't know. And notably, if Grice is right, then you cannot provide an analysis in the other direction. It will always be from particular instances up to general meaning, never the other way down. That's a pretty fucking bold view. Again, this seems to make a hell of a lot of sense when we think about how languages might get started. Because it's very hard to get things going with this pure language first and then down to intentions model. But something like this maybe gets us going. So let's talk about two problems with the view. One of them is a friendly problem, and it's kind of about the details. Another one is a much more significant problem. It's a bad problem. So here's our first problem. It comes from Searle. So Searle says, right, okay, here's a problem case. And it's a little bit ridiculous, but it makes sense. So Searle says, imagine that you're an American soldier trapped behind enemy lines in World War II, right? And you're specifically in Italy, and you come across some Italian soldiers. And you want to convince the Italian soldiers that you're a German officer. Apparently just a German office. Wish I could remember how to say office building in German. I can't. So, you want to convince the Italian officers, the Italian troops, that you're a German officer. So what might you do? Well, so Searle, one way to do this is by telling them, either in German or Italian, that you're a German officer. Say, in either German or Italian, I am a German officer. That would be great. Except, unfortunately, because you're American, you don't know any German or Italian. You're monolinguist at best. So what can you do? Well, Searle says, going way back to a literature course, you can remember one line from a German poem you read. And what you can do is just say this one line, one German line, and in saying it, you will get them to believe that you're a German officer. You will invoke in them the belief that you're a German officer. They will see your intention to invoke in them that belief, and they will come to believe it. So you say, kennst du das Land, wo die Zitronen blumen? Does everyone know what it says? Yeah, okay, good. Now, per Searle, in this case, this weird little case, we've managed to tick all three clauses of Grice's account. You have an intention. Your intention is for them to believe that you're a German officer. You want them to clock that intention. And you want them to use clocking that intention to come to believe that you are in fact a German officer. That's part of the causal mechanism. But of course you're doing it by speaking German and saying something that does not in any way, shape, or form non-naturally mean I'm a German officer. The intention alone doesn't make this say I'm a German officer, no matter how hard you want it to. Because this says something about where the lemon trees bloom. So says Searle, look, meaning is more than just a matter of intention. There's also going to be conventional constraints. No matter how hard you want the intentions to go, there's going to be linguistic convention that forces this to non-naturally mean something about lemon trees. Do we see the force of the word? So again, the thought is, no matter how hard you want it to go, you can't have I'm a New Yorker non-naturally mean I'm from California. Because there's meaning to those words that's beyond just pure intention. There's conventional meanings. To put another way, to go back, relativized meaning gets you so far, but at a certain point, the conventional, non-relativized meaning constrains you. So this is our first problem. It looks like there might be cases where convention will constrain or prevent certain intentions. So there's our first objection. Grice, unsurprisingly, says no. Grice does not like this idea of invoking conventions because, again, he wants conventional meaning to be reduced back down to individual speakers' intentions. So this is a no-go. His response is to say, look, the case you've just given me is under-described. And once we actually fill it out, this doesn't turn out to be a problem for me. Either you're talking about it incompletely, you're talking about the wrong action, or you're talking about the right action, but just in the wrong kind of way. So here's the two ways you can fill it out. Our first case, right, our intention is to get the Italian soldiers to believe that he's speaking German, and then hope that the soldiers will draw the conclusion he's a German officer, because only German officers would go around speaking German at this point in time. And if that's the case, well then, are our three clauses ticked? Well, if we go back and look, right? In this case, there's an intention. He wants them to believe he's a German officer. Or rather, he wants them to believe that he is speaking German. I note in that case, is there really anything that's even kind of non-naturally meant or conveyed? It's not even clear that we really need to worry about that. We just need to make the appropriate sounds. Maybe more importantly, the thing that we're leaning on, that's he's a German officer, or that I am a German officer, is never actually strictly communicated. It's meant to be kind of, to use a term we're going to talk about next week, implied. It's supposed to let the hearers just figure it out on their own. It's not being directly communicated. In which case, cool, no problem. Our three clauses aren't in fact. Because 2 and 3 fail. The other way we could fill it out is that the intention wasn't to get them, or to hope that they'll draw the conclusion, but it's to get the Italians to believe that he said he's a German officer. In which case, actually this goes through. Because it doesn't matter what the actual linguistic expression says. All that matters is there's a certain kind of performative aspect going on, and it's the right kind of performative aspect that has an intention, that has a reflexive intention where hopefully the other people acknowledge it, and once they've seen that, that will be a cause for the relevant belief. So you can either catch it out in terms of believe that he's speaking German, and then figure out the conclusion that he wants, in which case it's not a problem, or there's a particular inducted belief, and it's no problem, we've achieved our goal. So this one, not so bad. Let's talk about the big bad one. Here's the big bad one. And this isn't just a project for the particular Gricean analysis, but this is a problem for this whole intention-based semantics. The whole big project. This is a bad problem for the big project. So this was first raised by Platz, but it was kind of kicking around even back when Grice was first developing the idea. Put really bluntly, it's that intention-based semantics can't provide a non-circular account of the meaning of unuttered sentences. So, right, the whole story for this semantics is we start off by particular uses, utterances, individual utterances. And their intentions tell us the meanings of what was going on in those cases. Why does my use of Gödel prove the incompleteness of arithmetic mean what it does? Because I have certain intentions. You recognize those intentions, and you come to believe certain things, and blah, and blah, and blah, and blah, and blah. What do we do about sentences that no one's ever said before? First glance, this might seem kind of silly, but it looks really plausible that they have particular meanings. Another way to put it, natural language contains infinitely meaningful sentences. And no matter how hard we work, we're only ever going to say finitely many of them. So what accounts for the meanings of the unuttered ones? How can we say this is true? Well, it can't be the intentions of utterers because there are no utterers. To put it another way, it looks like there have to be constraints on what we might think of as hypothetical intentions. Were someone to utter this, there's restrictions on what they might have meant. So here's a silly example. 13% of all Brabantian kangaroos prefer noodles to champagne. Meaningful sentence. Presumably no one's ever uttered it. If you don't like that, just change the number here to a different one and keep going until we've found a different value. Now here's one hypothetical intention. I might utter that to non-naturally mean that snow is white. That's the exact face we're supposed to have, right? Look, that's not what that means. Even if no one has ever said it, that's just not what this means. This means what it says. As fucking weird as it is, right? It's talking about kangaroos that live in Brabant and their preferences. Weird, but that's what it's about. But of course, there's nothing that prevents me, at least in principle, from reading this as just a non-natural way to say snow is white. But that's not right. It's not what this sentence means. So what's the problem? The problem isn't that we couldn't use this expression to say snow is white. Again, if Grice is right, then we can, if we try hard enough, we can use any expression to say anything we want. The thought is that before anyone ever said it, this had a particular kind of meaning. There was a certain base intention that would be expressed by this kind of a sentence, even if no one had ever used it before. So do we see the thought there? Now that's going to be a huge fucking problem for this story. Why is it a problem? So if the sentence comes with a kind of hypothetical intention or a built-in constraint, yeah.
Can you say in short that if you go by this idea, for any sentence, there should be a meaning, because every sentence is formed through a meaning or intention.
Something like that, right?
Yeah, okay. And that's why the weird sentence can come down to means the snow is white.
So
because the person who said it could have a certain intention. Yeah.
So we have two kind of pressures, right? One of them, I think, what you were just articulating is, look, if it really is entirely intentions, then we should be able to do anything with any words. And that seems a bit weird already. And in fact, you can kind of see some worry like this lurking in the Searle case. The real problem is the other way around. So here's the real problem. This story tells us sentences only ever get their meaning through intentional usage. But it looks like we can have some sentences that are meaningful without ever being used. And even if the restrictions on meaning are just hypothetical, were someone to use it, you could only use it in these kinds of ways. Well, that's bad, because where the hell are those coming from? It can't be from intentions, because no one said this yet. There are no intentions hooked up to this expression. So, here's the challenge. Say what would have been intended by an utterance without appealing to the meaning of the words it contains. Because one natural explanation here, to go back, is, oh, here's why this is constrained in the various ways that it has meaning. This means from Brabant. This means kangaroo. This means has preferences. This talks about noodles. This talks about champagne. And then we constrain them together to form a whole sentence. Can't do that, because that's appealing to pre-theoretical, pre-intentional notions. The meanings of these constituent parts are telling us the meaning of the sentence, not the intentions of users. That's problematic, because our whole project was supposed to be the other fucking way around. Users get us to part meaning, not part meaning constrains users. So as Platt puts it, just read this because it's a nice summary. So generally, the constraint upon the hypothetical intentions with which a sentence can be uttered is precisely the meaning of the sentence. If this is correct, the attempt to define the meanings of unuttered sentences in terms of hypothetical intentions and responses is hopeless. It presupposes a prior notion of sentence making. What's the thought? The thought is that we'd already need to have meanings in order to constrain the hypothetical intentions that any utterers of these unuttered sentences could mean. And that's bad, because on this picture, we should never have those meanings. It should always be reducible back down to intentions. There are no intentions in this case, yet there seem to be meanings. Problem. What's interesting is that this sort of issue is never going to be a problem for projects like Russell's and Frege's, and Ronald Griffith's. Because if you remember, back when we were talking about Frege believed in this idea of compositionality. The meaning of a sentence is driven from the meaning of its constituent parts. So the parts come with meanings, we then stick them together using grammatical rules, and that will tell us why this sentence means what it does, and will provide the constraints. So we end up in a weird position. We have this beautiful Gricean project, and my God, it's beautiful, of founding everything on speakers' intentions. And that's clearly going to work really well when we're thinking about the beginnings of language and how it gets going. And it seems to kind of get it right about why we can play around with language in many ways. But we face this weird problem about language, especially natural language, seems to allow us to, or allow for, sentences that no one said yet that have meanings. And that shouldn't be possible on this view. So we have a really good story, for some cases, driven by this kind of intention-based semantics. And it runs into some problems with what do we do with sentences like this that no one's ever said before but have meaning, or seem to have meaning. And if you think about the flip side, the story that we were looking at earlier, with this kind of compositionality, the words have individual meanings, and that's going to give us the meanings of sentences. Well, hell, we've run into a bunch of problems with that. We don't even know what half the things we're fucking using mean. We don't even know how names work. That's supposed to be the easiest part. So if this is the story that's going to work better, oh God, we're in trouble. And if the intention-based story is going to work well, oh God, we got a big story to tell. Yeah, as always, the fun part is the problem rather than the solutions. But do we see the problem? Do we see the tension here? Why this kind of unuttered but meaningful sentences are difficult for this view? Maybe here's a different question. So there's whether we see the problem. What do we think? Do we buy it? Do we think it's a problem? Always worse than when I can hear the clock. Hopefully that means you're thinking rather than just completely zoning out. Yeah. How might we solve it? No pressure.
Well, why not just use both? Sort of allow for meaning in from words or sentences or whatever, and then put that in the context in which it is said. So now it is or. So it's either it derives its entire meaning from how it's intended in speech, or it has you derive it from what it sort of abstractly means. But I think you can do both and recognize that it has a meaning in just being words or sentences, but then the meaning can be altered by its usage or intention or context.
See, I think it's a very sensible story. A couple things to kind of flesh it out. What comes first?
The intention that it already has by virtue of it being a word in culture or.
So at the very base level, to go back a few slides, it's going to be relativized meaning first. And then we get non-relativized meaning that's going to constrain later uses. Is that the idea? Does that make sense? So it'll be particular intentions to link sounds with meanings or intentions. And then that will maybe give us the foundation for language, and once we have enough people, they'll coalesce.
Would baptism account of meaning be non-relativized?
That's an interesting one, right? That's one where you have something like a combination of the two. So it's relativized in that you have one initial speaker saying, okay, this thing, whatever the hell it is, we're going to call Dave. Everyone can now use the name Dave, and it will get us back to the initial thing. So you might think this is a fun case where there's an initial intention that fixes the kind of description, fixes the meaning, but it isn't the meaning. Because remember, in the reading and on the Kripke account, the meaning of the name is going to be whatever it is that you've actually named. So it's somewhere kind of in between, but it's definitely not going to give us this beautiful intentions first story. Because really the meaning is always the thing out there. Maybe to kind of come back, I think one version that isn't too far off from what you were suggesting is an idea that we have initial just pure intentions, and after a while uses start to what's called ossify. Are people familiar with that term? So it means to like harden, to turn into bone. So uses kind of ossify over time and they become conventional. So we no longer need to have specific intentions for why sentences mean what they do. They simply do because we've got enough people using it that way that it automatically does. If we like that, we can have stuff coming in two different directions. Intentions get us to a certain level of ossification. Ossification can then explain later uses. And I think this is a very sensible story. The problem is that it looks like we might be able to cook up examples like this that are going to circumvent our potential ossifications. Be harder. It'll be harder. But harder just means we got to work harder. Again, the fun tension here is how do we reconcile apparent meaning for unuttered sentences when the only time we can get meaning is coming from or derived from our intentions. Here's a really silly solution. I quite like this. This is one that's been proposed recently in the literature. This is what our AI uses can be for. We just have them start pumping out all the sentences, and if we have enough computational power, we can utter every possible sentence we could ever get. It's stupid, but it would be lovely, because then we would just have intentions behind everyone. It's not, but it's a...
But doesn't the meaning of that sentence, the intention depends on the context. So you can say every sentence, but that doesn't mean that that sentence has been used in every possible way that it can be. Yeah. So then that multiplies it by like a million.
The size of the infinity just got big. But again, it's a fun and weird product. So we have this very sensible, I think, picture. We start off with speaker intentions. And speaker intentions can get us very, very far. And it looks good. And then think about these weird sentences that no one has said. It looks like they have meaning. And if they have meaning, we're in trouble.
But doesn't having meaning depend on the reflexive intention, so that if you're saying to me like 13% of the kangaroo, blah blah blah, doesn't that require me understanding that you're trying to tell me that Snow is white?
Yeah. Cool, keep going. Tell me more.
So that doesn't seem to make sense. If you're telling me that sentence, no reasonable person would ever think, oh, he's telling me that Snow is white.
So that's kind of the problem. Right? It looks like that even though no one has ever uttered this sentence, we have a pretty good grip on what it means. It's never going to mean that Snow is white. It's going to mean that there's a weird percentage of kangaroos that live in Brabant that have preferences for noodles over piece of drink. Or something along those lines, right? Maybe I'm using Brabantian kangaroos in a weird sense, but we have a rough idea of what this says, and it's never going to be the same. This is the idea that there's kind of constraint on even the hypothetical intentions that might be
Look like an absurd way to make it work, right?
Maybe.
Like if you say this sentence enough times to someone while pointing at snow and then a white sheet or something, then maybe.
So I think this is going to lead us to the problem we're going to talk about at the very end, which is how we might even understand those kinds of cases. When someone is trying to communicate with us, trying to follow something like you might think of a semantic rule, and what exactly the rule that we're trying to convey is. There is one possible response I want to float by you guys and see what you think. Why don't we just say that this doesn't have any meaning, or there is no constraints on the hypothetical intentions, and the reason we think it has such things is we're conflating it with other sentences we've read before, which are close but different. What do we think of that? This could mean Snow is white, after all. I mean, I feel like...
So then just say again, like this means what we think it means because of convention. We've seen similar sentences before.
So then we're kind of back into a version of something like Searle's problem. Meaning's more than just a matter of intention. Convention gets in the fight too. Or at least in some cases. But if that's right, then the whole reductive program fails.
You could also say that it has a meaning, but it's meaning's fault. Something like that.
So in some sense, it doesn't really matter whether the thing expressed is, whether the meaning that this has is true or false. We don't really care. Just that it has one, which Because if it has one in its non-natural sense, we've already got the problem. The problem is that this expression seems to convey something even though no one has ever said it. There's a kind of constraint on anyone who would ever use it. And again, we've used this example enough. If you don't like it, come up with any other weird sentence that you think no one has ever said that's grammatical in English, and it seems like it will have a kind of meaning, or you can get a grip on what it might mean. And as soon as you do that, we've already got the problem. So, okay. That's the big issue. That's one of the big issues. Things to be said here. So let's kind of wrap up. So what we have is basically a kind of oddity on Grice's account. Okay. For Grice's account, next to no weight is placed on the role that words of speakers use, right? A speaker in uttering X can basically kind of non-naturally mean whatever the hell they want. Notably, that also means that what they might not naturally mean goes well beyond the kind of thing that you might expect them to have actually said. The words that constitute their utterance, well, they might suggest something, but that doesn't actually mean anything, with regards to what they really meant. The account of non-natural meaning provided doesn't distinguish, you might think, between what a speaker literally says from what they may succeed in conveying. Searle's example gives us this, right? Our sentence says something about seeing the land where the lemon trees grew. But you might use it to convey, oh, I'm German. I'm a German officer. Even that's not what it says. It can convey things beyond what's literally said. And that seems true. And note that kind of point seems to go beyond whether we buy the intention-based semantics or not. So what we're going to do next time is this distinction between what's literally said and what we're conveying. Or, to put it in Gricean terms, what's said and the implicatures behind what's said. So that's our topic for next time. We're going to talk about what's said versus what's conveyed. There's a very fun paper, also from Grice, from Logic and Conversation. I would really suggest reading it, if not just because it's a fun read. It's entertaining. And what we're going to talk about here is this deep difference between semantics, which is what we have been talking about pretty much so far, and pragmatics. And it will bring together the stuff we've just done with the speech act stuff, the lecture before. Cool. All right. Any last questions before we wrap up? Beautiful. Well, thank you guys for coming. Have a lovely week. And I'll see you next Tuesday.